Doctor Who, ranking regeneration stories. Hello and welcome to this week's video. Let's do something a little bit different this week. Do a countdown of the regeneration of each Doctor's, starting from the weakest, in my opinion, to, in my opinion, the best regeneration story. Now, I don't think... What is this? There's about 11 here I'm counting, I think. So, at number 11, the worst Doctor regeneration story. Well, that's got to be Time and the Rani, hasn't it? That's got to be the 6th Doctor's regeneration story. Because he regenerates in the pre-credit sequence, and it's not even Colin Baker, it's Sylvester McCoy in a wig, because Colin got the boot and told him he wouldn't be fucking coming back just to make the transition easy. So that's it. So, I mean, I know, yeah, I'm not counting Big Finish stories and any of that. I'm talking about TV stories here. Canon, you know. So, yeah, it's definitely the worst regeneration story. Number 10, the TV movie. Not much of an improvement over Time and the Rani. We get to see Sylvester McCoy here, the 7th Doctor. He's in it for about 2 minutes, gets shot, and then dies on the operating table about 10-15 minutes in and turns into somebody else. Yeah, that's, you know, well, at least Sylvester's there, I suppose, but yeah, it's still pretty crap as a regeneration story, isn't it? Let's face it. 9. Moving more into proper regeneration stories now. The 11th Doctor's regeneration story, Time of the Doctor. Now, I consider myself mostly a fan of the 11th Doctor's era, even if it did go downhill as it went, but Time of the Doctor is really a really, really piss-poor regeneration story. I think, you know, a lot of the issue with this, especially when it's with New Who, is making these regeneration stories like Christmas specials and New Year specials and this sort of thing, because regeneration stories are supposed to be dark, they're supposed to be epic, they're supposed to be, you know, a Doctor going down, and yet at the same time you're trying to make a Christmas story, which doesn't really, you know, those two things don't really gel very well. It's very boring. The humour is cringeworthy, and it really doesn't feel anything remotely like Doctor Who. One thing I'll say about Time of the Doctor is that it does have the actual regeneration scene is really good. In fact, it's probably the best regeneration scene in all of New Who, and one of the best, period. It's a lovely scene. Matt Smith's great. Amy's in it, which always makes me smile. But the story as a whole, yeah, it's not good. 8. The End of Time. The End of Time is not much better. I'm sorry. I'm sure I'm going to get hate from the Davies acolytes. It's not good. It's bloated. It's overlong. It's a mixture of plotless and too many plots. John Sims Master's hideously fucking irritating here, and I actually quite like him in you know, his others. But in this one, he's really over the top and really freaking annoying. And the elongated, extended regeneration scene where Tennant goes on a world tour or something is awful. Awful! I say it again, it's awful! It's just it's not a good story. It's just not. 7. Logopolis. The 4th Doctor's regeneration story. Good old Tom Baker, the best Doctor, in my opinion, and the opinion of all right-minded people. Unfortunately, Logopolis is again another disappointing regeneration story. You know, with Tom was, you know, clearly getting fed up over the course of season 18, which is why he left, working with a more controlling production team than he'd ever had to put up with before, sucking all the fun out. And it just feels really wrong, Logopolis, as a regeneration story. He's surrounded by companions that he barely knows. All the great, and are not very good either, let's put it like that. And the story itself is just dull and monotonous, and Tom should have gone out in a great grandstanding gothic, like State of Decay or something. This is just so boring. 6. Planet of the Spiders. Now, I'm not a big fan of Planet of the Spiders either. This isn't going very well, really, is it? But I will say this for Planet of the Spiders. It does at least feel like a John Pertwee story. Logopolis doesn't really have much of a feel of the Tom Baker era to it at all, whereas Planet of the Spiders, it does at least, it reeks of the era. That was clearly the intention, and they pulled that off. Again, I'm not a big fan. I don't think it's a very good story in itself, although the regulars are acquitting themselves well. And like I said, it does at least feel like it belongs in this era. And even if I'm not a big fan of the story, it feels appropriate enough as a way to send off the Third Doctor, even though I still think it could have been better. 5. The 10th Planet. Now this is here predominantly simply because of its placing as the very first Regeneration story. There would be no Doctor Who anymore if they hadn't came up with this wild idea to regenerate or rejuvenate the lead character and change the actor. It's a wacky idea as hell, but it obviously it was a great one and it worked. And of course the other thing about the 10th Planet, of course, is the Cybermen are introduced for the very first time. I'm not a big fan of these Cybermen. The idea is reasonably sound, but it's not very well executed. And they come across as being kind of silly looking, and one of them sounds like Zippy from Rainbow, which doesn't really scream terror to me. But it's okay, I guess. 4. Now we're getting into regeneration stories I can kind of say that I actually like. This would be Bad Wolf, Parting of the Ways, the 9th Doctor's regeneration story. I'm not a big fan of Davies' era. I don't think I'm shocking anybody by saying this. I'm not even a big fan of Series 1 these days. But this is a solid enough, an exciting regeneration story, a big Daleks epic, etc., etc., with many great moments. It doesn't quite hang together, and I have a serious issue with, the way the Doctor is treated. Somebody else basically saves the day in his regeneration story. It doesn't quite sit right with me somehow. But like I said, it's exciting enough to pass muster. 3. Now then, this is a bit of a quandary, because when it comes to the 12th Doctor, Peter Capaldi, what do you classify as his regeneration story? Do you count it as Twice Upon a Time, in which he actually regenerates? Or do you classify his regeneration story as being World Enough in Time and the Doctor Falls, because that was intended to be his regeneration story, and it's in that story that he is mortally wounded and causes his regeneration? I'm gonna go with the former, because the latter, apart from being insulting and offensively crap, again, it wasn't intended to be there. The only reason it was even made was because Chibnall was too much of a lazy bastard to come and make a Christmas special. Stephen Moffat, they'd left. The era was over. World Enough in Time was intended to be Capaldi's exit and Moffat's exit, and the only reason Moffat came back to do another one was so that they could keep the Christmas slot. Yeah, how'd that work out? Anyway, I'm counting it as World Enough in Time. And I think this is a cracker of a regeneration story. Yeah, okay, part 1 is significantly better than part 2, but I still don't think part 2 lets the side down enough for it to spoil it. It is a really exciting story. The first half has some really atmospheric and really scary stuff in it. And it does what I would have considered to be impossible, and actually make the Mondas Cybermen seem impressive and quite chilling and scary, because I've never found them as such in the 10th Planet. They just look too cheap and silly for me, whereas it actually works really well here. I think this is generally a really good story. I think it's a shame that we had to have a totally unnecessary and crap epilogue tagged onto it, because this is a cracker of an exit for a Doctor. It's much better than Time of the Doctor. 2. The Caves of Androzani. You knew this was going to be up there in one of the top spots. The 5th Doctor's exit. What more is there to say about it after all these years? It's a blazing, gripping thriller. Very dark, very bleak, very gritty. Peter Davison is on fantastic form. And it's a sensational exit. It's Bob Holmes coming back to the show to show them how it's done. And he does just that. Number 1. My favourite regeneration story. I'm sure you can pretty much guess what it is right now. It is, of course, the 2nd Doctor, Patrick Troughton's regeneration story, otherwise known as the War Games. Now, I love the War Games anyway, as a story in its own right. It's in my top 10 favourite stories of all time, and has been since I saw it a long time ago. So it's perhaps no surprise that it is my absolute favourite regeneration story. It's 10 episodes of pure atmospheric, exciting, twisty-turny thrills, spills and atmosphere. It's got one of the greatest TARDIS teams in their very last blowout, because obviously they all go after this. It's not just the end of Patrick Troughton, it's the end of Jamie and sexy little Zoe as well. It's the end of the 60s, it's the end of the black and white era. It really is the end of an era on all fronts. And it's just a cracking exit for Patrick Troughton and for that entire era of the programme. I love the War Games, and it is by far my favourite regeneration story.